Good morning, everyone, and I want to, on behalf of Schuler Books, thank you all for coming here for the second meeting of the Detroit Jewish News Book Club. So happy to see all of you here.
So to start with, when you read about Albert Kahn, who is famous, the industrial architect of the 20th century, global industrial architect of the 20th century, you don't hear much about Julius Kahn. How'd you discover the story?
Well, that's an interesting story in itself. When I was working on my first book, I discovered that somebody in Albert Kahn's office, his brother Julius Kahn, who was a civil engineer, had actually invented the first practical process of reinforcing concrete with steel so that you could use it to build a building. And it was a big deal at the time. Yet nobody's ever heard of this guy. And even when you looked up online, there'd be maybe 2 sentences about him, and that would be it. And I thought, well, there's a story. And it's really, for young authors like myself, it's always a good idea to start with something that hasn't been done before. And so I as I was finishing up my first book, I started working on this book on Julius. But there's another side of it too, which is you hear about many different people who've invented things. The Wright brothers, of course. Henry Ford didn't really invent anything, but he brought in the moving assembly line. We know all about Sacagawea. We know about many different people that were on coins or on stamps. But here's a guy who invented something that every single one of us uses every single day, and nobody's really ever heard of him. And I thought that was an unfortunate circumstance that needed to be rectified.
The other thing about Julius and Albert that I find interesting, starting off with some biography, is they come from very modest means, if not near impoverishment, and immigrant parents. And so I wonder if you could discuss their background in the Kahn family a little bit, especially all the brothers and sisters who had accomplishments of their own.
Yeah, well, it's a good idea. I was studying up to remember all the brothers and sisters' names yesterday. Actually, Albert and Julius had 6 siblings, so it was quite a large family, 2 parents and 8 children. The story really starts in Germany, where the family lived. The father, Joseph, was a rabbi, a successful rabbi, but success 150 years ago means something different than today. It didn't necessarily mean a big house and 3 cars. But the problem in Germany was, and many people are not aware of this, that Richard Wagner, the composer, was a vicious anti-Semite who had published early on anonymously an anti-Semitic screed, and later, when anti-Semitism became more popular and accepted, republished it again under his own name. And this led to increasing anti-Semitic activity in the German state, and something new that we haven't experienced. Groups of students were out collecting signatures on petitions to have citizenship stripped from the Jewish members of German society. And then the violence started, and at that point it was Joseph's decision that they had to get out of Germany. So he left, and 6 months later the rest of his family followed, and they ended up settling in Detroit. Why Detroit? Well, Detroit had a very large German Jewish population. Probably Joseph figured he could get a job as a rabbi in Detroit. As it turned out, though, there were many German Jewish rabbis in Detroit. And in fact, something that most people aren't aware of, services at Temple Bethel were actually conducted in German. And that was obviously because it was a vast majority of the population was German-speaking or Yiddish-speaking. So he wasn't able to get a job doing that. So he started a restaurant. That didn't work out. It burned down. That was one of the family's first experiences with fire. And then Joseph ended up getting these itinerant rabbi positions around the country where he would a new synagogue would open up, and they would hire a rabbi to come in temporarily until they had the funds to hire somebody permanently. But the family really stuck together, and when Joseph was out of town, when Albert got to middle school, he actually quit school and took on a full-time job in order to help support the family. And but things went okay. I mean, they were middle class, or maybe lower middle class, however you define that term at the time. And they would go from periods where they had money to periods when they didn't have money. Joseph had enough money from one of his gigs to buy land and build a house, but then a few months later, when the house was built, he tried to sell it, because he needed the cash. So things were back and forth. It wasn't really a stable situation, but they made the best of it. And Albert was the first child, the oldest child. Then Gus, he also quit school and started in the steam fitting business. But then Julius and all the rest of the siblings all ended up going to college and getting degrees and working in either engineering or in architecture. Mm-hmm. And to a large extent because they stuck together. Albert helped pay for Julius's schooling, and it worked out well that way.
Where did you go to school?
Julius and all the other siblings that went to college went to U of M.
Julius Kahn, his big invention is, as Michael has already mentioned, is reinforced concrete. The first person to develop a system that worked for reinforced concrete. And again, it's something that sounds a bit boring on the surface, but as we sit here now, there's reinforced concrete under us, the walls, the roads we drove in on, and it was, as one historian put it, or actually he was an architect, I think, is the 20th century was the concrete century. This changed everything, and that, of course, your book really explains well. But why? Why do we need reinforced concrete?
Yeah, it's a good question, and most people today, including me, before I started in on this, had no idea what the invention of concrete meant. And in the most important function, it served as a fireproof building material. Now, none of us were alive back at the turn of the last century, but it was commonplace back then for buildings to burn down. 1 month in the city of Detroit saw about a dozen major businesses burned to the ground. And when I say burn not like today where the fire department comes and puts it out. Burn like either there was absolutely nothing left or there were the walls of a building that were left. And everything was burning down. The schools burned down in I think a 10-year period. The Detroit High School burned down, the Pontiac High School burned down, the Ann Arbor High School burned down, and there was one more, I think it was Port Huron High School burned to the ground. So it's not just the loss of the buildings, but the loss of life too. And it got so bad around 1902 that the insurance companies met and decided they had to implement an emergency 25% increase in the rate of insurance because so many warehouses and factories and retail stores were burning down that they were going to be out of business. And many of them actually stopped selling fire insurance altogether. Now, this didn't affect the businesses so much as it affected the consumer because those costs were passed directly on to the consumer. So you had a major, major problem, particularly in the cities, of these important and growing businesses burning to the ground very quickly with no way to prevent it. Now, it wasn't because of the fire department was inadequate. Actually, fire departments around the turn of the last century were not that much different than they are today. The fire engines were pulled by horses, but the pumpers actually had pretty close to the same capacity to be able to put out a fire. So there was a serious problem that really had to do with building material. Now, architects and engineers knew that concrete would be the perfect solution. It was cheap, it was readily available, It was available everywhere where you needed to build buildings, much more available than steel. But engineers had not figured out how you could actually build a building with concrete. And in those very few cases where buildings were built with concrete, they used so much concrete and steel that it actually was more expensive than building the building with steel, because they had no way of knowing how much weight, for example, a steel and concrete beam could support. There was just no engineering theory. Like if you built with a wood beam, engineers could tell you exactly how much weight the beam could support. If you built with steel, the same thing. But concrete, there was just no data whatsoever. So that was a serious problem that engineers around the entire globe were attempting to solve, but were simply unable to do so. They did not understand exactly how they were going to solve that problem. And Julius Kahn, who at the age of 28 came into a partnership with his brother Albert as a civil engineer, and discovered through his own research in the basement of Gus Kahn's house a theory of how you could use steel to reinforce concrete. And he invented a thing that would actually allow you to do that. And I've got one I can show you. You can hear me right now, right? This is a piece of steel rebar that came from the Packard plant that was recently demolished. And obviously it's bent now because they had to tear it out of the building. But this is what Julius invented that actually worked, that you could use to cheaply and efficiently build a concrete building. And you're welcome to come up here after and touch it if you want. It's not fragile.
Maybe give us a couple examples of the buildings we would know.
Well, in Detroit, almost any building that was constructed prior to, say 1930 and after 1905 that was reinforced concrete would have been built with Julius Kahn's system, though not necessarily designed by Albert's company. The very first reinforced concrete automobile plant in the world was actually built in Detroit. It's at 450 Amsterdam Street downtown. It was the original Cadillac factory. That building's being turned into apartments right now. You know, you pick just about any building along Woodward Avenue. Buildings right along Woodward where the Shinola Hotel is. The Shinola Hotel itself was built with Julius Kahn's system. It was a very innovative building at the time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, but we are going to open it up for questions now.
Was rebar already being used in other ways, or did he have to invent that? And did the window casings that were metal, did he have to invent that? And how did he create the learning curve to train people to do that?
Well, those are three great questions. So rebar existed. It was called reinforcement bar, and it did do that. It made concrete stronger than it would have been otherwise. The problem was they did not know how much stronger it made it. And what would happen is they would put rebars in a concrete beam and they would test it in the laboratory. One beam would, say for example, fail and collapse when you put 1,000 pounds on it. Then the next one would collapse under 25 pounds. So what you have to do then is you have to assume that the strongest beam can only support 25 pounds. So you have to make the beam 4 times as big. So you end up with these monstrosities of a building that could only be used by companies that were manufacturing explosives or processing whale blubber or something like that. So it was an unknown quantity. And also Julius discovered, now I don't want to get too far into the engineering, but he discovered that there was a type of stress that existed in concrete beams and concrete floors that other engineers had not recognized, and that type of stress was typically the reason why these beams failed. And oftentimes there was another type of failure where the rebar would just simply pull loose from the concrete, and once it pulled loose, then the beam was doomed. So there were all kinds of problems that prevented it from being used. They had a concept, it's just like the Wright brothers didn't invent the airplane. I mean, everybody and their brother was trying to invent a way to use a motor and something that had wings and get into the air. But it was the Wright brothers that figured out the theory of it and also invented a machine or an object that could take advantage of that theory and work. So the second question was the windows. Okay, the windows that we see today on these old multi-story factories were actually invented in England. And the fellow who was the chief designer for Albert Kahn's firm when they were building the Highland Park factory was a British citizen, and he happened to know about these windows. So he recommended that they be used on the Highland Park Ford factory. That's why that factory has those types of windows that fill the entire space between the vertical columns and the beams of the factory. So Julius saw those, the way those steel frames were manufactured, and he and one of the people in his firm invented a way to manufacture those steel window frames in a more efficient way, in a way that the other company in England was punching a slot into the pieces of steel, which weakened it significantly. So Julius and this other fellow figured out a way and patented a way that bent it around the pieces, and so that was a much superior method of doing it. And so they literally invented a new way of manufacturing it, even though they didn't invent the concept of the frame itself. And then the third question.
You have to make these things, so you have to stay ahead
Right.
so that you can produce them in quantity. So how do you
Well, that was,
do that?
I mentioned that Julius had a way of running things that has lessons for us today. And one of those was he would specifically hire inventors, and he would give his engineers a certain percentage of time to use facilities of the office to just work on things that they thought they could improve or invent from scratch. And then he would patent that, and the person in his office that invented it would get a certain percentage of the revenue from that invention. He paid his machine workers, if they could exceed 80% of the rated output of the machine, they'd get a bonus. So he was tremendously ahead of the curve in terms of rewarding his employees for inventions, for improvements, for increases in efficiency, for operating in a more efficient manner, and that's how he stayed well ahead of the curve.
How many patents did Julius have?
Julius had at least 76 patents. The way the patent database operates, you can search, but it gets a little hinky when you start to get towards the margins of what somebody was involved in. But he had over 76 patents.
What were some of the richest resources that you used to research the book?
There's one resource I use very extensively, the internet. Because a lot of this has to, you can't rely on books like mine to give you the honest truth about what happened. You have to go to my book and the citations and the endnotes to go to the primary sources. That's where you're going to really learn about what happened. And those primary sources are newspapers from the period, which you can get from newspapers.com. And there's several other sources. The Jewish News Archives is great if you're doing research on Jewish topics. Journals, which are available through the University of Michigan. I think it's called the Hathi Trust. They have all the journals up to about 1923. For some reason, they stopped there. But I was fortunate with this book. Everything I was researching just about was before 1923. So you can read, Engineering Record and Locomotive News and all these different things. And that's where I was able to find articles that Julius Kahn himself had written. Because you have to go back to those primary sources. Now, I think I did a good job, so you can generally trust what I wrote in my book. But if you're in doubt about anything that I've said, you can go back to the citations. Now, if you go to a book like The Buildings of Detroit, there's tremendous numbers of errors in there Like, for example, the casino on Belle Isle is claimed to be an Albert Kahn building. Well, it's not an Albert Kahn building. So there's a mistake right there. I wrote a whole article that was published in the Journal of Society of Architectural Historians about the Albert Kahn building number 10 at the Packard plant being the first reinforced concrete automobile plant. It was not. The first one was the Cadillac Motor Car Company plant. But for over 60 years, that was thought to be and acknowledged to be the first concrete auto plant. Simply because there was a mistake made at one point in the past, in the 1950s, where somebody mistakenly said this, and so everybody would go back to that article and cite it as the source for this being the case. You can't go back to the 1950s to learn about what happened in 1905 and 1906. You have to go back to journal articles and newspaper articles from that period. And the internet really facilitates that. So you too can do research in that period now. Yes, sir.
I might add, before David asks his question, that one of the first things you learn when you work on a graduate degree in history is the footnote trail, that's the key for reliable history.
What reaction within the architectural engineering community has there been to your book, which is Rediscovered Julius Kahn?
I hope it turns out to be positive. It's too soon to tell, actually. The book just came out in August. My first book, Designing Detroit, was actually very well received. I was invited into a number of different architecture firms to speak on the topic. The American Institute of Architects recognized me with an award for bringing forward a lot of history that had either been forgotten or never known about. So it's a little too soon to tell how this book will be received. Turns out that the Concrete Institute of America, or whatever it's called, is based right here in Michigan. And on their web page, they claim that the Packard Building number 10 is the first concrete auto plant. So hopefully things like that will change, but it takes some time. Like if you Google that now, it'll reference my book as opposed to before it referenced a number of other articles on that particular topic. But it takes time. It takes a couple of years before those concepts. This book is all new history for the most part. History that's not been written about. There aren't books about. There aren't journal articles about. It's going to take a few years for that to seep in and be accepted and recognized by the architectural and engineering community.
What's your next project?
My next project, can I?
Yeah,
Can I
sure.
talk about? Okay. I've been commissioned by the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit to write a history of the Jewish community from 1967 to the present. And that's a follow-on to the Bulkowski book, which is from 1914 to 1967. So I would beg you, if you get an email from me asking you a question about some arcane, bizarre thing that happened in the 1980s, please respond to me. I mean, I have this problem when I'll write to these bigwigs in the Jewish community and I say, you were at such and such a place at such and such a time. Can you tell me what happened? I don't get a response. And I'm not sure if it's because people are afraid they're going to make a mistake or they've forgotten. But it's okay because that's a secondary source as far as I'm concerned, because people remembering what they did 50 years ago is a lot different than me reading an article from the day after it happened 50 years ago. So I need to talk to people in order to get a story, but then I have to go to the original sources and find out what really happened. Whether, there's probably the story is there, but I've got to get the details right. So that's my next project. Look for that book probably in about 4 years.
Quick question. You mentioned their young ages growing up and having to move around a lot. What was their artistic education? Because a lot of this, you have to have an artistic mind.
Right.
And not only numbers for architecture and whatnot and engineering, but the art to conceive of this and to put it together. Did they have any influences with that from mother or teachers, or not just from books? It has to come from somewhere.
Yeah, I think that in Germany, now we're really talking about Albert here. Albert was 12 when he came to the U.S. The rest of the kids were either very young or unborn. But Albert, I think, had a typical traditional middle-class German upbringing, which included, obviously, music, art, languages. Joseph, when he wasn't rabbiing, he was tutoring people in German, Yiddish, French, and made a living in that way. So they were very well educated. Now, I imagine that the parents continued that once they moved to the U.S. and continued to have that level of influence on them. The father was out of town a lot, but I think there was probably just that sense of commitment to knowledge and education in the family. And I think it was also a period of time in the U.S. and the world where much more value was placed on education than now. I mean, now there's a tremendous sense of education being relative, that beauty is in the mind of the beholder, as opposed to beauty is a part of the thing that was created by the artist that created it, whether the artist was competent at creating beautiful things or not. At the time, you had to learn how to both admire beauty and create beauty. In fact, in the Detroit Public Schools, in third grade, third graders learned about Greek and Roman architecture. And they were told to travel around the city and identify buildings that were neoclassical in nature. Then in the fifth grade, they learned about Gothic architecture. And they learned about the geometric patterns of the architecture and how the construction of these buildings and that sort of thing. We're nowhere near that sort of thing in elementary schools today, obviously. So it was a different period where there was much greater sense of achievement in art and music being something that was learned, mastered, and both appreciated by learning and appreciated by being a master in that field. That's a lot different than today, where things in architecture are horrific. Art is, you can have a blank piece of paper. If you call it art and you're a respected artist, by God, it is art, as opposed to something that requires a mastery, in a field to be able to learn how to do. So unfortunately, architecture doesn't really exist now except as a practical science, how to build a building so it doesn't fall down and so it suits the needs of the people inside, which is obviously very important, but aesthetics is not really a part of that any longer.
Before I turn it over to Paula to wrap up the show, I'd like to say a couple things. First, please subscribe to the Jewish News. I'm putting a plug in because I've got the mic. We're a nonprofit now. We've got a subscription drive going, and we'd love to have you on board. Second thing is, you're in a wonderful bookstore. Buy something. Paula will love that. Third thing, if you did not get a Jewish News book club bag, we have a few up here. And the fourth thing, and most important of all, join me in thanking Mike. This was excellent.
Thank you very much.
I told you he was a good, entertaining speaker, so you lived up to it. Thank you very much. Paula?
And looking forward to seeing you at the next Detroit Jewish News.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.